Okay, hi all. So welcome to the lecture of epidemiology and nosocomial infection. Okay, at the end of the lecture, so we'll have an understanding on the different reservoir of infections and also understand on the various modes of disease transmission, and also we'll have some definitions on epidemiology, susceptibility and transmission. Okay, let's start with the definition of epidemiology. So epidemiology comes from Greek word, so where epi mean upon, demi mean people, and ology mean study. So therefore, epidemiology mean study of factors and mechanisms involved in the frequency and spread of diseases within population of humans, animals, or plants. And usually, epidemiology studies will examine factors involved in the incidence and spread, prevention, and control of infectious and non-infectious diseases. And one of the biggest organizations that usually do epidemiology study is World Health Organization, or WHO. And usually from the epidemiology studies, WHO will provide information and methods used to understand and control the spread of the disease. For example, for the COVID treatment and then the COVID prevention. Usually all the recommendation we get it from WHO. Okay, disease in a population can be endemic, sporadic, epidemic, or pandemic. Okay, let's come to the endemic. So endemic is a disease that is present continually in the population, and the number of reported cases and the severity is usually low. And usually it is not a public health problem. And one of the example of endemic disease is common cold. Okay, sporadic. Sporadic is a disease that occurs occasionally involving several isolated cases and no great threat to the population. Okay, the following one is the endemic. Endemic is a disease that acquired by many people in a short period of time. An example of endemic diseases are influenza and measles. Okay, pandemic are diseases that are spread worldwide. For example, SARS, bird flu, and also COVID-19. Okay, in a summary, if it's an endemic disease, so it's a disease that present continually in the population and it's also not a public health problem. If it's a sporadic disease that occur occasionally and involving several isolated cases. If it's endemic, it's disease that are acquired by many people in a very short period of time. And if it's pandemic, so it's a disease that spread worldwide. Okay, let's move to the next topic, which is reservoirs of infections. So reservoirs of infection are living organisms or non-living substances that continuously provide a pathogen with adequate conditions for survival and multiplication and opportunity for the transmission. So the reservoirs of infection can be human reservoir, animal reservoir, or non-living reservoir. Okay, human reservoirs. So human reservoirs are literally referring to the human. So the main living reservoir of humans are human body. And then the people who harbors pathogen and transmit them to others without themselves exhibiting any sign of illness, or in other words asymptomatic, is known as a carriers. An example of human reservoirs diseases are diphtheria, salmonellosis, epidemic meningitis, amoebic dysentery, pneumonia, and streptococcal infections. Okay, the second one is the animal reservoirs. So animal reservoirs referring to the reservoir that are having animal as the host, and that's including both wild and domestic animals. And let's move on to the zoonosis. Zoonosis is a disease that can occur in animals but can be transmitted to humans. And transmission of zoonosis can be happen via direct contact with infected animals, or contamination of food and water, or direct contact with contaminated hides, fur and feathers, and consumption of infected animal products, or via insect vectors. Okay, these are the few examples of zoonosis diseases such as anthrax, ringworm, and salmonellosis. So perhaps you can read on your own. So if you have any questions, please post in the question box. Okay, the last one is the non-living reservoirs. So the non-living reservoirs literally referring to non-living substances. So for example, soil. So soil harbor pathogens such as fungus and clostridium, which produce spores. So the spores usually found in the soil. The second one is the water. So the water can be contaminated by feces from human and animals. And the last one is the improperly prepared or stored food, which usually happens via food poisoning. Okay, let's move to the next topic, which is disease transmission. So in this topic, you have to know two things, which is portals of entry and portals of exit. So portals of entry mean sites at which microorganisms enter the body. So it can happen via respiratory tract, which is through inhalation of droplets containing bacteria or dust particles that containing bacteria. Or it can happen via gastrointestinal tract, via food, water, milk, or via licking fingers. It can also happen via skin and mucous membrane through ducts of sweat glands, mammary glands, and hair follicles. And sometimes can also happen via parenteral route, which microorganisms introduce into the system through bites, burns, injections, or accidentally via surgery. It can happen also via placenta, usually happens from mother to the baby. Okay, next is the portals of exit. So portal of exits mean sites where microorganisms leave the body. It can happen via respiratory tract through coughing and sneezing, gastrointestinal tract via fecal material, genital tract via secretion from penis, vagina, and urine, and sometimes skin and wound infection through pus and exudates, and blood, so the blood from the infected animal or human, or milk from the breast milk from the infected animal or human. Okay, let's move to the modes of disease transmission, which means how a disease can be transmitted from infected animal or human to a susceptible or a healthy human or animal. Okay, it can happen via contact transmission or transmission by vehicles or transmission by vectors. Okay, the first one is the contact transmission. So contact transmission can happen via direct contact transmission, indirect, or via droplet transmission. Okay, direct contact transmission. So direct contact transmission usually requires a body contact between the individuals in order to the infection to happen. So let's say the first one is the horizontal transmission, means individual pass pathogens by shaking hands, kissing, touching, or sexual contact, or usually it's happen via unhygienic practices. For example, COVID, which can be transmitted from a person to person if any of them with the infection doesn't following a proper hygiene. For example, using masks and sanitizers. And it can also happen via vertical transmission, which means the pathogen is passed from parent to the offspring in an egg or sperm, across placenta, in breast milk, or in the birth canal. So usually transmitted from mom or dad to the baby. Okay, the second one is the indirect contact transmission. So indirect contact transmission happen via fomites. So fomites mean non-living objects that can harbor and transmit infectious agents. For example, handkerchief, eating utensils, doorknobs, toys, and money. Okay, the last one is the droplet transmission. Droplet transmission happens via coughing, sneezing, or speak near others. So usually when a person or infected person cough, sneeze, or speak, he will generate droplet nuclei. Droplet nuclei mean droplet containing bacteria or virus. When a person coughs, sneezes, or speak, he will generate droplet nuclei that can be inhaled directly or can be collected on the floor with dust particles or can become airborne. So when a susceptible person, when he come contact with these droplet nuclei, he might get the infection. Okay, the following mode of transmission is transmission by vehicle. So vehicle mean is a non-living carrier of an infectious agent from its reservoir to a susceptible host. And usually this vehicle can be water, air, food, blood, or body fluid. For example, food poisoning. So ingestion of microorganism, especially pathogenic microorganism, through food or water will produce toxin in the human body, and that will cause neuron damage, death, and localized inflammation and gastrointestinal upset. Okay, if it's an airborne transmission, it happens via droplets containing pathogenic microorganism move from an infected person to a susceptible individual, which happen via coughing, sneezing, or through dust particles. Okay, the last one is the transmission by vectors. So vectors mean is a living organism that transmit disease to humans and is mainly arthropods. So which can be ticks, fleas, flies, lice, and mosquitoes. And the mechanism can be either mechanical or biological. So mechanical transmission means the insect carry the pathogen on their feet or other parts of the body and transfer to the food. So when a person eat the food, and then he might get the infection. An example of mechanical transmitted disease is typhoid fever and shigellosis. On the other hand, biological transmission means insects transmit pathogen actively, which means the insect infected with the pathogen and then is transmitted to the human. An example of diseases are malaria and bubonic plague, and dengue is also one of the examples of biologically transmitted disease. Okay, this diagram shows the difference between mechanical and biological transmission. So let's look at the mechanical, which is this one. Okay, let's say a fly go and sits on the fecal material, and usually the fecal material will have pathogenic bacteria. And after that, the fly go and sits on the burger. So and then this food will get contaminated with the pathogen that found in the stool. And when this healthy person eat the burger which is already contaminated with the pathogen, he might ended up get the pathogen in him and then he gets sick. On the other hand, if it's a biological transmission, so first the mosquito or the arthropod will get infected with the pathogen first. After that, this infected animal go and bite the uninfected person, and then the pathogen is transmitted throughout this person's body and then he gets sick. Okay, this table shows the vector transmitted diseases. So the thing that I want to emphasize is the etiological agent and vector. Let's say, for example, yellow fever. So the etiological agent is the yellow fever virus and the vector is mosquito. So which means people will get yellow fever because of the yellow fever virus, but then it's transmitted through mosquito. So the same thing goes with the dengue fever. So the dengue fever is caused by dengue fever virus and then is transmitted via vector mosquito. And the same thing goes for plague. So the etiological agent is Yersinia pestis and the vector is fleas. And then malaria, so the etiological agent is Plasmodium species and then the vector is mosquito. Okay, the last topic in this lecture is the nosocomial infection. And nosocomial infection are also known as a hospital-acquired infections. So which mean the infection that you're getting in the hospitals. So for example, pneumonia. So people tend to get pneumonia after surgery. Okay, sometimes people will get urinary tract infection after the insertion of catheter. Sometimes puerperal fever after the gynecological procedures. Okay, the sources of nosocomial infection can be exogenous or endogenous. So endogenous mean is caused by opportunities from the patient's own normal microflora. Sometimes people call as a self-infection. This happens via the bacteria from the microflora become infectious to the patients. And an example of bacteria are including E. coli, Enterococcus, Staphylococcus aureus, and Pseudomonas species. On the other hand, exogenous infections are caused by bacteria that enter patients from the environment, and this is usually called as a cross infection. And this cross infection can happen from other patients, staff members, visitors, fomites, or equipment, particularly contaminated equipments. Okay, this is an additional slide just to give you an extra information on the nosocomial infection. So read your own. So if you have any question, please post in the e-learning. Thank you for your attention, everyone. So please don't forget to post your question in the e-learning.